All right. So going to be super informal, just the process. Thank you very much, Claudia, for joining us. And what we're going to do is go through a couple of slides about immigration. Hopefully everything turns out well. Share my screen and look at a different screen so I can see what you see and figure out why that is on Monday. All right, so we'll go back to the very beginning. Are you able to see the slides?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So just roughly, this first slide is just what everyone got. Claudia's intro, bio, and this is an actual picture of Claudia. So what I'm going to do is introduce her a little bit, and then Claudia, allow you to introduce yourself. I'll go through a few slides, and then we'll talk a little bit on the other end about the experience of immigrating, both immigrating with an E and with an I. So Claudia, she is an author, a businesswoman. She has professional practical experiences in administration and managerial appointments in corporate world, the arts world, government. She's done some amazing things that I know from knowing her personally, from working for British Airways, which is really interesting. And also even doing fashion modeling, which I think is amazing. Claudia has a lot of cultural humility, has done things like Toastmasters, tutoring, so interacting with people on an individual basis and in the corporate world. So with that, I will say that she is one of my closest friends. I consider her family. In fact, I list her as family on anything where we have to identify somebody here in Canada. And I'll turn it over to you. And thank you, first of all, for being here with us, and then ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And you are my baby sister, so there we go. How can I top what you just said about me? So so I'm 50. I just turned 50. I'm very proud of saying it, so I announce it. I've realized that I've been outside of home, which is Paris, for longer now than I've actually lived in Paris. So I moved first to London, because it's very close to Paris. It's a train ride away. Because I wanted to perfect my English, and I just wanted to be out of Paris. So I moved there with my then boyfriend. I found a job at British Airways, and I thought, being immersed in another culture with another language, even though I've actually learned English well into my university years, it's completely different to actually talk to someone who's coming from Cornwall or someone who's coming from Newcastle. So that was an interesting experience. And what I really enjoyed, so what I call the Superman effect, is because I wasn't home, I was this French person that everybody had assumptions about. And luckily enough, being a French woman is often equal to being glamorous and being able to enjoy things and being romantic and stuff, which I'm a little bit, I have to admit. But that was interesting to actually be seen through that scope. And then I've met my Australian husband in England, so we moved to Australia. And that was another culture shock. My husband is Caucasian and male Caucasian, so really in his life he didn't have as much issues that I might have encountered. And we stayed there, so we had a baby who is adorable, who is 17 now. And I tried to work, so I set up a catering business, because my Frenchness actually saved me from being stuck at home with the baby. Although I love him, I just needed more adult and grown-up interactions, emotional interactions anyway. So I set up a business from home, and then when Aiden started to speak and be active, we thought, okay, so we need to find a place where he's going to be able to actually hear French and English in equal parts in his life. And we thought, oh, Switzerland would be great. And so we applied for Switzerland, and because Europe is specific. North America, I'm still finding my bearings a little bit in North America with certain things. Certain things are absolutely brilliant and awesome and phenomenal, and then that we don't have in Europe. but everything which has to do with sensuality, and I mean the food and the fashion and the way people go to museum and the access to art and philosophy and debate that I miss a little bit in North America. So we came to Toronto, and on day 38, I met Tiffany in Toronto, who became
You
my
came to Toronto from where? You were in England, but you talked about Switzerland, and then where do you go?
Australia.
Yes.
And then we came to Toronto from there. And yes, and I've been here. And then I find Toronto the perfect middle ground for me, because it has the French, even though it's not the same French, but it has the French and it has the English, and it's close enough. It's still in the Northern Hemisphere, because my being in Australia is mind-blowingly different. So I get a little bit jarred up emotionally there. So yes, and I'm an author and I write romance novels, because the only thing essential in life really is love. So yeah, and that's me in a nutshell. And thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. I've decided to do something a little bit different. We can actually just talk, and then if we get to the PowerPoint slides, we'll get to them. If not, I'll post them and students can take a look at them, because they are static. They are what they are. So we're talking about immigration, and we all probably have different immigration experiences of people we've known, people we've worked with. For me, as I was telling Dr. Lou or Victoria, immigration is weird for me, because I'm an immigrant Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, but Sunday and Monday I'm not, because I'm back in the US. So it's interesting to have a very different experience on migration patterns. You've lived in multiple countries. Tell me a little bit about what that's been like.
I love new beginnings. I have to say, I'm one of those person who I've always loved reinventing myself, because I take the experience and the hurt and the damage, but also the lessons that I've learned previously, and I bring them to a new environment, new language, because even though they speak English in Australia, it's a very different English in England. So what's been like for me, it keeps me moving. So therefore, and I realize that now, because Toronto is the country I've lived the longer in. So we've been here for 10 years. And before that, every 5 or 6 years, we would up and move. Like we uproot our lives and move. It's keeping me, because I kept myself on the move. I didn't always assess I want to say damage, but damage sounds really dramatic. The almost the scarring that it left behind, and I didn't have time to process. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean, France to England was nothing. It's really 3 hours, and I could actually go back and have lunch with my mother and go back into my culture and when my roots were, and then be fine. But England to Australia was being thrown onto another planet. And I was a first-time mother, and I had a 8 weeks old baby with me, and Australia has been, my experience in Australia has been, has changed me, has changed who I am at the core, because of the hurt I've experienced there, and because of, for the first time, I was just an alien. Like I was alienated in my own life, but I was also fetishized. I was the only Black person in a place when they had 200,000 people. I was the only Black person there, and I had my son with me. So it's, and I had to learn how to survive. I had to learn how to be a mother and to survive at the same time. So I created networks of friends and women, and I'm very good at sensing what's happening. Plus, I was very exotic. I was literally exotic. So I was really invited to a lot of places and to meet certain people because I was the only Black person there, and people wanted to know where my story and my history was. But it's just I was immersed too fast, too deep in Australia, and but I learned to appreciate, and I when you say I have some kind of humility, I think it really brought down to me that in order to who I was as a person, and I mean by that, although I look a certain way and I behave and I speak a certain way, at core I'm really, really kind and scared and lost like everyone else. And I had to actually rely on what I thought were my weaknesses in order to survive Australia. So I had to be open, even though I wasn't always ready to be open. And I had to actually open myself, otherwise I would something would kind of die inside me. So Australia was this massive bomb that exploded in my life in terms of immigration, so much so that after 3 years, I was like, okay, I need to go back home. I need to go back home. And we talked with my husband. I was like, and I know it's your home, but I really need to go back home. And home wasn't Paris, home wasn't England, home was the Northern Hemisphere. I just wanted to have a cold Christmas. Mm-hmm. That's all. Like Christmas is the summer, so you have 45 degrees over there. I just wanted to have a cold Christmas. Mm-hmm. So it actually widened the scope of what I call my home, mm-hmm. in a way. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. So then you moved from Australia to Canada.
Yes.
How Canada? Of all the places in the world, how did you just choose Canada?
Because of the French and English education, because like a lot of people, funnily enough, I assumed that everybody was bilingual in Canada. Like you walk into, but that's not the case. So Canada was as close as I could get to home, because again, I assumed that if I went to Quebec, these French people and Quebecois have a very, very weird relationship, but I assumed that I would be welcome with open arms because I was French and that's all I needed to be. And sometimes I just needed to be that. And then so we came here in the summer, and that was the summer when the garbage trucks were on strikes. So Toronto really didn't smell too good. The humidity was a little bit jarring compared to Australia, who had very dry heat summers. And it took me probably a couple of years to actually settle down with a new child, and finally I could get work, and people didn't look at me. I wasn't the only Black person in the neighborhood. And then I met you, which was very significant because it was just like, okay, so I'm going to I'm not going to reveal things, but it's just, okay, the way I met Tiffany. So we just moved into this house / big apartments type of things in a very posh area of Toronto. It's the north of Toronto, but it is the neighborhood is wealthy. Let's put it that way. Therefore, it has the best schools, which is why we actually moved there. And it was my first summer. Well, we've been in Toronto for 34 days. We're still waiting for our furniture from Australia, which took another 2 months. And I went downstairs because I was smoking cigarettes at the time. And I went downstairs and I see Tiffany, and then she sits down and she's like, hi. I'm like, hi. And I said, I heard you speak French. And then we had this big conversation in French. And we shared things. I shared things that I hadn't shared with anyone, and how I was feeling. and about my sex life with my husband because she's that easy to talk to. And we had this conversation, and he put me in that bubble when I was like, oh my God, I am actually home. I am actually home because I find this woman who actually looks like me, who speaks the same language as me, and then who loves Paris probably as much as I do. And then, so that kind of sealed the deal for me for Toronto. It's like, okay, this is home. I've arrived. Now I can start to build. So Toronto was like that. And because Aden was so small and the education system is so drastically, weirdly different in North America than it is in France, I had to deal with a lot of things, but I was more settled. And I, because we were neighbors upstairs and downstairs, I find myself at Tiffany's space a lot. And then we would talk, and we would talk about things, and we would talk about what it means to be non-white in this world. And because she was coming from the United States, but she has this way of explaining things to me as a Black European woman. It's like, oh, this is how it feels. Because on some things we could completely relate, and then something was like, oh, wow, no, like the US is harsh. And sometimes like, okay, so maybe Europe is not as advanced as it should be on certain things. And so I was home. I was home because I was grounded in family, and Tiffany is part of that. So Toronto is one of my favorite places. Although now that Aiden is going to university, I'm thinking maybe going back to Europe. I just miss the food. I think I just miss the food and the fashion, and I miss drinking wine and talking about the world, like we could be able to change it in a I miss that part a little more. But yeah, that's been Toronto for me.
So was immigrating less difficult into Canada than it was
Yes.
into Australia?
Yes. Oh my God. Yeah. Like 1,000 times more. It's non-comparable. It was just, I kind of, it's almost a feeling like when you're holding your breath. So in Australia, I held my breath for nearly 6 years. And then I actually breathed. I actually kind of exhaled when I was like, God, it's okay. I'm home now. And then I kept breathing. So yeah, so it was a very, very different experience.
And what about mental health? Did you have access to mental health supports do immigrants have access to mental health supports in Australia the same way that they do in France or England or Canada?
No, absolutely not. No, I remember I had an issue when I started to rely a lot of on wine to actually go through my days. And I had this fear because I was so isolated, and I didn't have anyone to actually talk to about this. So I thought I was an alcoholic, and then I was like, okay, so I'm going to do something about it. There's no way, and to find just an AA meeting or someone to talk to was brutally difficult. So it took me a couple of months to find a number that I could call. And then when I called, the man was like, oh, okay, so you have a problem. Come to this meeting. I was like, but it's like 15 kilometers from me and I don't have a car. And I was like, oh, but that's the only one in the region, and there was only one. And we're talking, even though it's not as populated as Europe or North America, it's a vast continent. Australia is a vast continent, so without a car, you're not going anywhere. And then I remember I was struggling with what they call postnatal trauma, because Aiden's birth was difficult. And I didn't get a chance to actually check with anyone. Aiden was 4 weeks old and we jumped on a plane to Australia. So it took me probably 6 months to find someone who would be able to understand where I was coming from. And funnily enough, my therapist was an immigrant too. She was Dutch. And so she spoke English, and she spoke a little bit of French, she spoke a little bit of German, and somehow the healing part came from the fact that I felt less lonely because my therapist was there. but it's more than a taboo in Australia. And if you being the only Black person and then having mental health issues was just much more than they could accommodate for. That's for sure. It is. I told my mother-in-law that my husband and I were going through couple therapy, and she actually burst into tears.
Wow.
Because that was the end of it. That was 10 years ago. And I was like, nobody, it's a good thing. We trying. It's like, and then came the blame, and then it was like, so you're forcing my son to actually go through something. But it's more than a taboo. It's almost like saying to people, I'm killing puppies in my spare time.
Wow.
From Australia.
Very interesting.
Yeah. You do not want to be you don't want to come out with mental health issues. So a lot of people drink an awful lot in Australia. So drinking kind of breeds dangerous behaviors. They are also very, very close-minded in terms of races, differences, and I'm talking sexuality, gender. I'm talking about all those kind of things. It's just, I don't know if it's worth being Black or being gay in where I was living in Australia. And I'm not talking about Sydney, because Sydney is this big, where a lot of English and European live, but I'm talking like cities like near Melbourne where we were, and it is still a challenge to get the help with mental issue. Yeah.
So it sounds like it was very isolating.
It is because they have because they isolate. So it's funny because Australia is this massive like Western country in the middle of Asia, like physically, and then there's this huge country which is also an island. So there's a lot of things in Australia. I was like, it is beautiful though. I mean, if you have a chance, go to Australia for sure. It's one of the most beautiful places I've had the privilege to be in, but it's sometimes it got stuck like 60 years back. So there's a lot of progress to be made. Like being gay is an issue, being non-white is an issue, being different is an issue. They have issues with the binary gender. So they have everything which is not predominantly classic Caucasian tropes of the 60s. They will react in a certain way, and which is super weird because New Zealand is exactly the opposite. And New Zealand is literally an hour from Australia. New Zealand is exactly the opposite. Like New Zealand is almost a hippie community.
Really?
Yes, it's come as you are. Yes. Oh, you okay? That's fine. And everybody is a shade of brown, and brown is the color that you want to be. Almost in New Zealand, it's so I know it's not because they're isolated, because this part of the world, it's just the culture they've been ingrained in, but which is completely British.
So I've thought about two things since you've been talking. One is you've lived in a couple of different countries, but working for British Airways, you got to see more of the world.
Yes.
That's exciting to me too. So as you traveled around the world, what did you notice about being in different places as a visitor versus being in different places as an immigrant?
Wow, that's such an interesting question. I've never asked myself that question, but the answer is very clear. So when I was traveling under the banner of British Airways, I was almost in a protective suit because I was there for 48 hours and I was just working, and I wanted to actually pluck out the best of the city at the time. So I would eat in the best restaurants because I was just here for one dinner. And I would go to the most expensive shops that we couldn't find anywhere else in Europe. So it was a vacation from my life, really, because I am glamorous enough, but I wasn't this person. It's almost a pretty woman kind of syndrome thing. It's just like all the bags, and when she's on, that scene when she's on video drive, and it's everything is just, and she walks differently, and the gait, and so it almost feels a little bit like that when I'm a tourist. And I'm also very open to people, and I think because it's a short-term thing, so I would go into really deep discussions with people at nightclubs and restaurants and saunas in Scandinavia, for example, because I was more open. So I would actually actively seek out people to talk to and to discover and to have conversations with, or get drunk with, or go to a sauna. They had this thing in Sweden when it's like you go to a sauna and it's like, oh, let's go into and jump in an icy lake. And I did that a couple of times because you truly find out who the real crazy people are, like the party crazy people are. So this is what it brought to me. And it's funny thinking about this because I was flying back home. So I was flying to Lyon and I was flying to Paris. And I still felt the same way. So I was in Paris and I knew exactly where I was, but I would go to this restaurant that I could never afford or didn't think I could when I was home. So yeah, it's a very different attitude. Yeah, it's a bubble feeling. It's like this, it's a bubble feeling, and it's just like, oh, everything is gonna be so nice because you only have 36 hours. Of course, everything can be nice.
And you get to go home, which is someplace else.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I get back to my life and my friends, and absolutely. But I love traveling. And we used to go to New York because I worked for the Concorde. So New York through the Concorde is just mesmerizing. I mean, it's one of my favorite cities in the world. But it's when you actually land from the Concorde and you have like the rich of the richest people like on board with you, so you get invited to things. It was like, oh, so let's invite the crew to, we got invited to embassies and parties and stuff, and we're like completely out of place. And it's it's my pretty woman experience.
Yes.
Without the prostitution part.
And that even reminds me, and this is for all of us to discuss, Claudia has had a very interesting immigration experience. I would say that I have too, in that it's like an immigration of privilege in some ways, because you speak the language, you understand the culture and the customs well enough to function. Not everyone has those types of privileged, not easy, but less challenging experiences. Have you had any experiences where you felt like it was more difficult, more negative with being an immigrant?
Me?
Any of us? You too.
Okay.
Closely, but anybody? Yes.
I wanna hear from Jessica.
Oh.
Okay. Okay, so Dr. TRW, well, thank you first. Thank you for sharing your experience and in the encounters and the different emotions that you've explained, and just for being vulnerable. And so first, thank you for that. And Dr. TRW, I want to be sure that that I heard your question correctly. What has been more negative experiences of immigration? Was that the question?
Yeah, it's and these could be things that you've heard of. We can all respond to them. But yeah, what are some of the challenges? For instance, I would say that most oddly of my negative experiences, and I've had a couple on either side of the border where I've lived, I've traveled to a few places. But one of the things that my daughter and I noticed is that sometimes in the States, when she's uncomfortable, she doesn't speak English. She would prefer to speak French. She can do that because she's bilingual. We've had people who have asked us, why we can speak a second language. And that question bothers me. Not what language is that, but the why. There's all kinds of stuff to unpack under somebody assuming that I shouldn't speak a second language or a third language. And you can even hablar en español if you want to. So the thing that is really interesting to me is even in doing research, in the US in particular, yeah, more so in the United States, when someone speaks a second language, if you just look at French and Spanish, and for the US, the reason that French and Spanish are studied is because, you know, Canada has a French speaking population and Mexico has a Spanish speaking population. When someone is bilingual, but it's English Spanish, it's regarded as more negative than someone who speaks English French, because that is more of an elite language, despite the fact that France and Spain, the last time I checked, are kind of close to each other, but they're different cultural currencies attached to, in North America, speaking these two languages. So for all of us, just what types of negative things might we expect someone who immigrates? Because remember, some people immigrate like Claudia did, or like I did by choice. Some people are in refugee positions where they have
Yes.
to leave, or they're doing it for reasons of safety. So what types of things do we expect to have to help our clients work through when they're people who immigrate?
Say some of those challenges, not only like Claudia mentioned, the perception of mental wellness, the perception or the priority of healthcare, depending on the locations, and something that that Claudia was speaking of was Australia versus New Zealand, and that a stagnant worldview that is in Australia versus the more accepting worldview in New Zealand. That made me actually think of the United States and a conversation I was just having with someone yesterday about how the willingness to travel and the willingness to explore different regions, it can be different. It's almost like a stereotype of like Northerners are more willing to travel and go different places, where Southerners are more stagnant in that worldview. But truly, I feel like you can experience it everywhere. And so just like her example of, you know, like Australia and New Zealand, with them being right there, I wonder, I almost wonder if it's more of the interpersonal connections that you know that allow worldviews to be more accepting, because she did mention that her relationships, like when she spoke with her therapist, she felt more comfortable while she was in Australia, and then her connection with you, like really, you know, like sealed that in Toronto. So I wonder, and so my question, I know that we're talking about, like, you know, negative or challenges with immigration. So I wonder if as advocates, we could possibly lessen the barrier or lessen the challenge, with the, you know, the ability to offer empathy and to offer that unconditional positive regard, as you know, as because I mean, and then it's religion, and then, you know, you all did, like you said, you had the privilege of the language, and then even the perception of the language, and something that I wanted to also ask Claudia. Well, I'll wait. I'll wait for my question on that. But as far as challenges, I mean, I can't think of an area of existence of a person that is not a challenge. You know, the acceptance of health, the acceptance of mental wellness, the communication, the language barrier. It could be currency. It could be understanding and, getting to the currency. Like she said, something was 15 kilometers away. So if I go to Australia and somebody says 15 kilometers away, for me, I'm gonna say, I don't know how far that is because I'm used to
That's
knowledge.
true.
So it's just so many.
Yes. Even the
It's,
things that seem small. Absolutely.
yeah.
It was interesting because we were talking about weather when we first logged in, and talking about the weather it is, that Dr. Wu has in Houston versus what we have here in Toronto. And I think I said it was whatever, 11 degrees, but then I had to say Fahrenheit just to make sure we're
Yes.
on the same page, because when I'm here in Toronto and somebody asks me the weather, I'm not exactly sure what the answer means initially. So if someone says, oh, it was 30 degrees, I'm waiting to think, is that hot or is that cold? Like, is it
Yes.
Fahrenheit or is it Celsius or centigrade? Because that's one thing I've had to learn to do in my head really quickly. So 30 centigrade, okay, 30 Celsius, it's about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So you have to be able to play around and translate things constantly. And that's still while I'm in a position of privilege where the language makes sense, just that, calculation is a little bit, metric is a little bit different for me. One
Definitely.
thing, Jessica, that you highlighted that I think is really important, and please anybody jump in, is the idea of empathy and
Yes.
understanding that process of moving for whatever reason from one place to the other, but especially if there are things, forced immigration or leaving a place that felt dangerous or leaving because you had no other choice. There's even a medical show, Transplant, that comes out of Toronto about a physician who left,
Yes.
I think it was Syria, he left to work in Toronto. And all the challenges that he faces, the post-traumatic stress of having left where he was and what he saw there and coming here and not being always well received when you're in your new space. And one of the things that I will forever remember is the process of becoming a permanent resident before I became a Canadian citizen required me to have physical exams. And I had to go to a physician, and I had to be kind of like turned around and looked, and I don't have tattoos, but tattoos and piercings had to be documented and it had to be weighed. And it was the weirdest thing in the world to me. And then I had to be x-rayed. I'm still not exactly sure. I, I would have told them I don't have tuberculosis. I don't know what it was they were looking for, but it had to be x-rayed. And there was a family there, and I talked about this last month at Trust the Process. There was a family there where they were trying to ask this woman, are you pregnant? Is it possible that you could be pregnant? Which is a question they ask all women. She didn't speak English and she didn't speak French. And the person at the desk didn't speak anything else, and they didn't seem to have access that day, at least, to a translator. So it actually became almost like a movie. I'm sitting here watching. This is the easiest question to find the answer to. It was not challenging, and he was not able to get this information from the woman. If you could just go, and that would just make somebody think, oh, no, I'm pregnant.
Right.
Or I am pregnant. And this woman was probably about 60 years old, which is probably why she didn't think he was asking her if she could be pregnant. And this went on for about 10 minutes. And it was interesting to see, like, this is just a simple question in a non-hostile environment. What must life be like for her to go and try to ask for help someplace? And once she finally figured out the question, she probably laughed for about 10 minutes. And she told him, no baby inside. And I was thinking, okay, so she had that much of English, but just that communication interaction was a challenge. And one other time, I was in the police station to get fingerprinted for the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association. And there was a woman in front of me who couldn't communicate with the police officer about something she needed in French, which was surprising given that this is a bilingual country. And that police officer said to me, do you speak French? I was like, oh, probably, it depends on what she says. And he says, well, you do it for me. I don't work here. That's when my American people, I don't work here, but I will help this woman out because she's trying to communicate. So I'm doing this for her, not for you. You work here as a government official. So it made me wonder, what is everyday life like for the people who have a language barrier? The only place I think I've ever been where I didn't speak, I've been to Germany where everybody seems to speak English, at least the places that I've been, and in Hungary. In Hungary, everybody didn't speak English. So I had to really work, and people were nice to me, but there were some people who you could tell just didn't want to be bothered. So I wonder, what do you think that might be like for people coming to a new place for whatever reason?
I wonder, that acceptance or, that lack thereof. And as you said, people, felt like they just didn't want to be bothered. Those nonverbals, those are definitely there. I can't imagine how that is carried. So Claudia, I'd like to ask you, what were some of the emotions felt? Well, you said you felt like you couldn't breathe for 6 years while in Australia. And so having the opportunity to breathe once you got to Toronto, I almost want to ask, like, what were some of the emotions? But I think that says it. I almost feel like you answered that, but I guess that would, for me, would have to go back to the need for empathy, as a professional. But it sounds like, I guess I can't answer it because I feel like Claudia did.
Okay.
I really feel like she did.
Yeah. And then Dr. Liu, I'll ask you too. You're in Houston. Do you work with a lot of
Yeah.
people who are in a position of immigration? People who
I do work with a lot of individuals who have that experience. I mean, when it comes to language, that is the first, with the way that we know, or we biologically know how to communicate with another person, right? So when that becomes a barrier, that creates a lot of isolation. So the more that barrier, the stronger the barrier is, the more isolated the person will feel. So in terms of the mental health, when I feel very isolated, then I don't feel like I can be connected with anyone else. The most likely I will hold on to my mental health struggles or challenges and not seeking any support, right? And that's very typical in a lot of individuals that have immigrated here has, language barrier. So I do speak fluently in Mandarin Chinese. So I do have a lot of individuals or clients, not a lot actually. I wish I have a lot individuals that do speak only Chinese, and it comes to me, and we have no barrier in terms of language, so they are able to actually express exactly how it's going on in their life. But oftentimes they tell me, that is one criteria when they leave cancer, is someone that can actually understand the culture and understand the language.
Yes.
That creates a lot of barriers for these individuals.
And have the humility to understand that if I don't know everything, I can ask this person.
I can ask my clients. That's right.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that you guys were talking about, the empathy. Like this semester I'm teaching multiculturalism. So we talked about microaggression. Oftentimes we feel like we're being empathic by asking certain questions, might turn to microaggressive comments and questions, for example. So when I came to this country, I was 18 years old, right? I was freely, my mom, higher education, blah, blah. So I came here with a privilege in terms of, I can choose to be here, or I can choose to go back, or do anything I want. So when some people told me in the beginning that you speak great English, I was like, oh yeah, thank you. I was really happy because I was not good at English when I was back in China. Let's just put that way. I did not like the language. Anyway, but so when they say that, was great. So after 20 something years, when someone told me you speak great English, I'm like, I should have because I'm being here I'm staying here longer than I was in China. So yeah. Or someone continued to ask me, now where are you from? I'm like, I'm from Houston. That wasn't enough. No, but like, where are you originally from? Houston? Is that good enough? So it's that I think sometimes when people feel like they are being empathic and also being, curious or being nice, oftentimes those comments and questions become very microaggressive for individuals have different experiences. So those are things. It's a very fine line, right? How you actually extend that empathy and to provide the empathy, but also understanding the questions. Why are you asking these questions?
Yes.
And Dr. TRW, that sounds similar to when you said people would ask, why do you
Yeah.
Right.
but
I still don't understand that question.
Right.
My
What
retort
is the
sometimes is, why
intention?
don't you ask me why I speak English? There's a big old story behind that. Ask
Yeah.
that one. And somehow it changes the tone of the conversation
oh wow, for
because
sure.
it feels aggressive to me, depending on
It
who's
is.
asking.
Yeah.
So
it
if
is.
somebody says, oh, you're speaking French, you know, so there's a whole story behind my grandmother liking the way France was receiving people when she was young, Black people in particular from
Yes.
lived in Georgia and foreign France. I can have that conversation, but why do you speak more than one language? That feels very different.
Yeah.
So I would like to ask another question to all three of you ladies, and with transitioning to another country, what do you see the difference in the your developmental stages of life, those transitioning at 18, I'm sure is way different, as you are in, late adolescence, is way different than transitioning or immigrating when you are in late adulthood as a parent. And now you have the you have to consider another child in this now, where when you're, transitioning at a younger age, then you're worried about personal protection, but you may even have somebody else protecting you. But then, as an adult, what differences do you all see?
That's an awesome question. Can I answer that one?
Yeah.
So when I immigrated to England, I was a young adult with no responsibility but myself, and so there was the freedom to be there, but the freedom was also in the fact that I could go back home. I could just up and leave and just go back home, and then and if I had a bad day, I could go and have lunch with my mother, and I could go back and see my best friend because we were 3 hours away. So there was all of that, and then so the way I enjoyed London is fully is I was there was nothing that stopped me from enjoying what I was, and if I didn't enjoy it, I just could go back, and I was in my mid-20s, early 20s. When I moved to Australia, that was 10 years later. I just had my son. I was a married woman. And that in itself, yes, the responsibility, I'm not on my own. In hindsight, well, I know that if Aiden hadn't been born when I was in Australia, I wouldn't have stayed for that long. Mm-hmm. I stayed because I had a responsibility that I took very seriously to my husband, to my marriage, and to Aiden as his parents. So they are things that I was willing to go through, and I did go through them because I wasn't the only one in the equation. So yeah, absolutely. And when we came to Canada, I had been a parent, I had been someone else's spouse and partner and support system for 5 years. So I was more settled in my different new roles. Mm-hmm. So therefore I was, yes, more open to maybe find other groundings that would root me in. So yeah, that was most question. So that was my answer, sorry. I just jumped on it because I was just like, oh my God, I love that.
Yeah. And I think I have similar kind of experience with Claudia, is that when I moved here, it was freedom, right? It was by myself. I was young. I can do anything I want. My mom does tell me what not to do, what to do. I can do whatever. And if I don't like it, I can go back or go to any other places I want to. So that was the freedom. And then it continued to happen for me. And I think I probably told this story, but there was a point of a transition for me to understand my identity a little differently. It was actually during my master level counseling, one of the class, I believe that was multicultural class. So I was doing a presentation in front of my classmates. And at the moment when I was doing presentation, there was a thing that dawned on me that I'm no longer a majority. And I had never thought about that because I have been a majority for all those years. So I had that privilege of feeling I was, and that includes my, my family upbringings that make me important, and I was cherished, I was loved, I was this majority. And then it dawned on me that I'm no longer a majority in this country. So what does that actually mean for me as a person, as an individual, if I'm going to continue staying here? So that was a transition in terms of how I actually perceive myself. Does that create negative outcome? I don't believe so, but it's a different way of looking at me in a different setting, in different time of my life, I would say. And also the transition of having, got married and had children, and that became something that I have to thinking about. My responsibility is no longer just me or anyone else, but with my children, and what is the future for them and what is future for me. So that is a completely different transition. I mean, obviously, when you get older, age or seasoned, let's put it that way, you will be more wiser, right? And that's how I feel that I am. I'm privileged and fortunate to gain a lot of knowledge to be able to see things a little differently. If that transition actually happened to me in a younger age, I probably would have handled it. So those are, and I think it's a continued transition and a continued, progress of who I think I am and where I find my place. And that's another thing that I thought Claudia is one of the points that made me think, where's my home? Instead, when she came to Canada, she feels like that's home. That's where home is. So as immigrants, oftentimes we have, well, at least I do, have that question. So where is my home? Is it geographic location? Is where my families are? Is where I am? Is where my children are? Like, where is my home? Yes. So that is, I think it's a constant type of question, and then changes all the time. I mean, for me.
I'm glad you brought that up. One of the things that I find very interesting is when I fly back into the States, normally I just drive because Ohio's 4 hours from, well, Toronto and Cleveland have 4 hours between them. But if I fly back, like for a work trip, which I used to have to do quite a bit, customs in the airport in Toronto for the United States is in the airport. So it's in Canada. It's physically in Canada, but that room is the United States. And I remember once going through customs, and the person there said, "Welcome home." And it felt very strange to me because I was thinking, if I commit a crime, I'll end up in a jail in Canada. So I don't know how home you are welcoming because I'm still here. But it just felt like there was, like it felt veiled, like he was saying lots of things. And that reminds me of the political pieces that we have to consider for people who immigrate. There was a lot of tension around being othered, especially in the United States, around the world. There's a lot of xenophobia, but in the United States in particular, we had several years of people being really less than kind to people they thought were different than them or not American enough or whatever that sentiment is. And that's something we also have to consider when we are working with people who immigrate. Some people come to the new place and they don't like the way that they're treated. So they almost feel like, I don't want to be a part of that, even though I cannot go back home. And that's something we also have to consider, because if I come to a new country, I'm the visitor. And some of the research that is on the PowerPoint that you can look at later after we wrap this up in a few minutes talks about how when you are the immigrant, you have to make sure you are aware that you are the guest in someone's home. Yes, I understand that sentiment, but if I come to your home and you treat me like trash, I may not want to be here But if my house burnt down, where am I going to go?
Exactly.
And that's the position some people find themselves in. Where can I go? Where is there space for me? I'm a good person. Sometimes I get into a cab, especially in New York, and you'll have a cab driver who's like a neurosurgeon someplace else.
Yeah.
Didn't translate to the United States. They're now doing a job that's very different than what they were doing otherwise. So you have this multilingual neurosurgeon who like invented body parts that you don't know about, and they're driving a cab, and people are disrespectful to this person sometimes because they believe that person who is doing honest work is beneath them.
Yeah.
That's a psychological barrier. There's an impact there to freely existing in this new space. So there's so many things we have to consider. All of us have higher education. All of us do. There's an advantage we have over many people in the places where we were born, all of us, because of our education levels. So there's a level of privilege, but then all still being female, all still being women of color, there's a disadvantage we still face. So it's such a strange space to be in. The two countries where I've lived, the place where I was told to go back where you're from was actually the US. I'm from Ohio. I actually am in the place where I'm from. And it doesn't happen all the time, but it has happened. I've met some weirdos here too, but it's on either side of the border. And even places where I've traveled, I've had some really interesting experience, most good, but some not so great. Sometimes opening your mouth and having an accent saves you. The meanest person in France that I met, I was really ready for my first stereotypical mean Parisian. I was all ready for this person because people are always very nice to me in France. Maybe it's because I'm attached to someone. You know, I was an exchange student in a family, so they were there. When we were there, once we were with your mom, Claudia, we were with somebody. So I've never experienced this mean French person. And I thought I found them. I was so excited to have this person be all kinds of mean to me. And when I asked him a question in French, the accent made him go, okay, what? And then he stopped being mean. And that was kind of interesting because I had a privilege associated with my accent that not everybody gets, that I don't always get, but not everybody gets. So as we're working with, and we can have one final takeaway because I know we're out of time now. What is one thing that we hope that people working with people who immigrate remember? What is something we hope that they keep in mind? Something that maybe we wish someone had done for us, or someone wish that someone had done for a person we know who immigrated. I can start. One thing I have to say is don't assume this person's stupid. Don't assume this person.
Right. Yes.
I would say to acknowledge the trauma that is associated with the transition itself, with making the whole move to find a new home, to find a new place of acceptance and a new place of belonging.
I would say there's a question I wish people ask me instead of that happened around. It's like, instead of asking me, where are you from? And I was like, France. It's like, no, where is your family from? I was like, okay, are you writing a book or something? But it's instead of asking me where I'm from, to ask me why I'm here. It's like, why are you in Australia? What are you doing here? What is it that you want? Not in an aggressive way, like you should go back home, but in a, I'm interested. Tell me why here of all places, because I can see that you're not from here, or I can hear it, or I can assume whatever I want. But why are you? Tell me why you're here. I wish people would ask me that question more, as opposed to where are you from? Then would be like France, and I would say France because the accent wasn't good. And I was like Paris. I was like, but where are your family from? And I developed this response, which is, why are you writing a book on me? Because I don't know you. But why are you here? Why are you here as opposed to where you're from? Because I'm here. We all come from somewhere. I'm here. Ask me what's happening for me now as opposed to what brought me here. Maybe I'll tell you. Yeah.
Well, I think I piggyback on what Claudia said. It's similar like what I think. And I like what Tiffany said about the analogy of using, a visitor come to our house, where the host, where the visitor is coming. And I like to use analogy vice versa, is that when I engage with someone else, wherever they're from, or whatever their experience is, they are the host. I'm their visitor. So I wanted to know about them as I am the visitor. I don't know. You are not coming to me. I'm coming to you. So I think I really like that way of engage with another person instead of feeling that they don't belong here. They don't belong to my house. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah. People have stories, and people often want to share their story with you. So that the last thing I'll say as we wrap up, and I do thank all three of you for being here. It makes me laugh because there was one cab driver in Orlando who said, "You should really go to Ethiopia and stay with my sister." And I don't even know your name, but I'm supposed to. He's like, she will give you a place to stay and all these things, which I thought were really sweet. Sean, my ex-husband, who, that's a long story, but Sean said he was once in Ireland and needed a ride, got a cab driver, and mentioned that he was thirsty. The cab driver goes, "Well, I'll just stop by my house. My wife will make you." And his wife was going to make him all this food, and it was like the nicest thing in the world, because people were just interested in, why are you here in this part of Ireland? What's your story?
Yes.
Where are you from? And when they found out he was Canadian but American, they apologized to him. He's like, "I'm not exactly sure why they were sorry to me, but wanted to make him tea and food and show hospitality and respond to the traumas that they assumed he had being Black and American." Canada wasn't quite as interesting as the American 3-4 years ago. So it's really interesting to actually treat people like humans, learn their stories, figure out how you can support them in whatever it is that they are experiencing, and treat them like they're smart, like they are able-minded people.
Yes, please.
Yes.
Please. Yes.
It's interesting. You can meet this person who speaks 73 languages and you think this person's not smart.
Yes.
You can talk to everybody on the earth and you think they're not smart. Not good.
Yeah.
So with that, I thank you all for being here. Claudia, I'll ask you to wait for just a second. Thank you to Jessica, Victoria, Dr. Wu.
Thank you. That was so nice.
Yes, and then everyone who's watching this by recording, the PowerPoint will be attached to the recording in Canvas. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Claudia.
Bye, Victor.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Jessica.
Bye, Jessica.
Bye.
I need to stop this recording really quickly. What happened to the recording button? Here we go. Stop the recording.
Yes.